Hello and welcome back to the Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 128 called The Abbasids, Golden Age or Age of Collapse. In the last episode, we ended with the overthrow of the Umayyad Caliphate by the Abbasids. Many historians call the Abbasid Caliphate the Golden Age of Islam. But in this episode, I want to analyse the contradictions in this description, since at a time when Islam underwent an undisputed cultural flowering, it also collapsed politically. So let's start where we left off in the last episode, with the Abbasid defeat in 750 of the last Umayyad Caliph Marwan II at the Battle of the Zab River. Marwan was wounded and fled to Egypt, where he was killed, and the Abbasid leader Abu al-Safa was proclaimed Caliph. Al-Safa massacred all 72 descendants of the Umayyad dynasty except for one, Abdul Rahman, who fled to Spain, where he set up the independent Umayyad Emirate of Cordoba. So, who were the Abbasids, and why did they rise against the Umayyads? The reason they gave was their devotion to Muhammad. Unlike the Umayyads, they claimed descent from Muhammad via Muhammad's uncle, Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib. They used this genealogy to pander to the growing popular dislike for the Umayyads, partly on the grounds they weren't devout Muslims, an accusation levelled in particular against the Caliph al-Walid II, who, as I mentioned in the last episode, painted his palace with frescoes of naked women and men drinking wine. In contrast, the Abbasids took pride in parading black banners, which harked back to the black banners Muhammad allegedly used to lead his followers into battle. But the truth, I think, was really that the Abbasids and Umayyads represented two sides of a divide that fractured early Islam. This was the rivalry between the Syrians and Persians. Most of the Umayyad supporters were Syrian, and they had made Damascus the capital of the Caliphate. In contrast, the Abbasids were based in the eastern Persian province of Khorasan, and their supporters came from across the old Sasanian heartlands of ancient Persia. Consequently, the first thing the Abbasids did when they overthrew the Umayyads was to move the capital from Damascus to Kufa in Iraq and then to Baghdad in 762. Baghdad became synonymous with Abbasid success. Over the next century, it grew into the largest urban conurbation on the planet, home to over 1 million people, probably exceeding Chang'an, the Tang capital in China, which is known today as Xi'an and home to the famous Terracotta Army, and significantly larger than its two European rivals, Constantinople and Cordoba, which may have each had around 300,000 inhabitants in AD 900. In comparison, Rome's population was barely 20,000, and those of Paris and London were even smaller. Baghdad was the showpiece of the Abbasid Caliphate. The second Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur inaugurated its construction in 762 with an outrageously ambitious building plan. The city's layout comprised two large semicircles around a circular core over 1 mile wide, known as the Round City. The circular design was based on Persian cities, such as the Sasanian capital of Ctesiphon. Designed to symbolize paradise, as described in the Quran, the city took 4 years to build, from 764 to 768, with over 100,000 workers involved. Just like the great cities of ancient Rome and Greece, it had an extensive system of fountains, public baths, drainage, gardens and villas. Water was supplied via canals, aqueducts and underground tunnels, primarily drawn from the Tigris River and the massive Narawan canal system. The main mosque and government headquarters stood at its centre. Al-Mansur recruited engineers and artisans from across his empire to build it. Most of the buildings were made of brick, although marble was also used extensively, especially for the steps leading to important buildings. The Caliph's Golden Gate Palace, which included an enormous dome, was the Abbasid equivalent of the Great Palace in Constantinople. The city had walls with 4 monumental gates leading to the empire's principal cities and regions, Kufa and Basra in Iraq, and thence to Syria in the west and Khorasan in the east. This remarkable city became the site of a cultural revolution. At its heart was the Great Library of Baghdad, also known as the House of Wisdom, founded by either the second Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur or the fifth and most famous, Harun al-Rashid. This became Islam's cultural centre for the next 4.5 centuries, until it and the rest of Baghdad was annihilated by the Mongols in the sack of 1258. It housed all the rare books that could be found from the Greek, Roman and Persian civilizations, which were translated into Arabic during the 9th century. This was the stimulus behind what scholars have called the Golden Age of Islam, since it established a library of learning in Arabic that was used to develop an Arab cultural identity. For example, the Abbasids encouraged research into mathematics, medicine, astronomy and philosophy. Literature flourished with an astonishing growth in the number of Arab poets, chroniclers and storytellers. The stories of the 1001 Nights, sometimes also called the Arabian Nights, a collection of popular Persian, Indian and Arab folk stories, was written down in Arabic for the first time. New stories were added to extol the Abbasids, especially some featuring the idealized Caliph Harun al-Rashid, which have more than anything else made him into a legendary figure in Islam, a little like the legend of King Arthur and the Knights of Camelot in Western literature. Perhaps the most lasting of the Abbasids' many scientific achievements was adopting the decimal counting system in mathematics, copied from India and exported around the Islamic Empire, which found its way into Europe via Islamic Spain in the 10th century and subsequently was adopted all over the world. This was a marked improvement on Roman maths, since the Romans didn't use a decimal system, preferring to divide by 12 and not recognizing the value of 0. Using Roman numerals like X for 10 and M for 1,000 meant they struggled with arithmetic and algebra, which Islamic scholars excelled at. So it's little wonder contemporaries and future historians have described this time as a golden age. But therein lies a paradox, for politically and militarily the Abbasid Caliphate was anything but a golden age. Indeed, soon after the reign of the celebrated Caliph Harun al-Rashid, who reigned from 786 to 809, it collapsed in a similar fashion to the collapse of the Carolingian Empire in the west. So let's start with the reign of Harun al-Rashid. Our first task is to separate fact from fiction. This is difficult since, as I mentioned, Harun figures in the fictional 1001 Nights, making him into a sort of Islamic version of King Arthur. But unlike Arthur, he was a genuine historical figure, and his reign marked not just the peak of Abbasid power, but a crucial turning point in Islamic history. Contemporaries described him in glowing terms as a champion of art and culture and a fearless warrior against the infidel Byzantines. As one of them wrote, quote, "The reign of al-Rashid was one of the best of reigns, most replete of dignity, splendour and charity, and the one which most increased the extent of the realm. The Caliph was outstanding, a poet, an authority on history and poems, of nice taste and discrimination, respected by both his friends and the common folk." End quote. But the reality was, I suggest, more prosaic. Coming to the throne in 786, aged 21, he was dominated initially by his powerful mother, Al-Khayzuran, a worthy Arab equivalent of the Empress Irene, who seized control of government when Harun's father died. Luckily for Harun, he got on better with his mother than Constantine VI did with his mother Irene, who, you will recall, had him blinded and killed. And she helped to build his reputation even before he succeeded his father. She also conveniently died 3 years into his reign in 789, freeing him from her domination. He also had the support of the powerful Persian Barmakid family, who were administrators and financiers for the Abbasids. Khalid, the son of Barmak, who founded the family dynasty, had been the chief minister for the first Abbasid Caliph al-Safa, who reigned from 750 to 754. The Barmakids maintained a close involvement with Abbasid government until Harun banished them in 803 when he became worried about their growing power. Harun's reputation was mainly built on one thing: fighting Byzantium. As discussed in episode 126, Byzantium was weak in the late 8th century, struggling with the internal divisions the Empress Irene had created in the army and over the worship of icons. And on the battlefield, a much larger contingent of excellent, heavily armoured Persian horsemen, which had been largely absent from the Umayyad armies, helped the Abbasids. For these reasons, Harun restored the caliphate's dominance over the hated Eastern Christians. His success began early in his career, in 782, before he even became caliph, when he was still a teenager and nominally working for his father. As mentioned in the last episode, in that year, an Abbasid army invaded southern Anatolia. At first it looked as if the Byzantines would trounce them, since the army was still led at an operational level by the battle-hardened veterans who'd driven the Arabs back over the last half-century. But Irene had given overall command to one of her incompetent eunuchs, who was foolish enough to walk into a trap, and he was captured. Irene paid tribute for his release, thus beginning a humiliating 2 decades when the Byzantines became tributaries of the Abbasids, despite having a better army. This unexpected success was the basis for Harun's career, when his mother engineered the idea that he'd been responsible for the victory in order to cement her own control over him. He was awarded the epithet of al-Rashid, meaning the wise, before he became caliph. The damage Irene did to the Byzantine army allowed him to reap further rewards. He scored another victory over the Byzantines at Padandus in 788, and in the 790s he organised regular raids into Byzantine territory, although the success of these has, I think, been greatly exaggerated by Islamic chroniclers. The Byzantine Senate and army was disgusted with Irene's capitulation to the Abbasids, but the damage she'd done took time to repair. When Nicephorus I deposed her in 802, he sent Harun an insulting message asking for the tribute she'd paid to be returned. In response, in 805, Harun invaded Anatolia, defeated Nicephorus at the Battle of Krassos in Phrygia, and attacked Cyprus. Nicephorus was handicapped by the rebellion of one of his leading generals, Bardanes, and agreed to pay an annual tribute of 30,000 numisma. The Arab chroniclers made much of Harun's success, but it was to be the last Abbasid victory. Another part of Harun's legend lies with his famous diplomacy. His court at Baghdad was renowned for its opulence and sophistication, and inspired respect from Charlemagne and even the Tang dynasty in China. He used this to cultivate alliances with both of the great powers. For example, Charlemagne's biographer Einhard describes with astonishment the elephant Abul Abbas Harun sent to Aachen in Germany as a present for the Frankish emperor. And it's true, the Franks and Abbasids collaborated against the Emirate of Cordoba, and even, some of the time, against Byzantium as well. But the reality was very different. The Abbasid Caliphate was in fact a smaller and less powerful entity than its Umayyad predecessor. Right from its start in 750, the western provinces had broken away when the fugitive Umayyad Prince Abdul Rahman established the independent Emirate of Cordoba. The Berbers had rebelled in 741, and the entire Maghreb, i.e. Morocco, Algeria and Tunisia, broke away from the Abbasids under the Idrisid dynasty in 789. Admittedly, Tunisia paid tribute to the Abbasids, but otherwise Iberia and Ilfrica, as the Arabs called Roman North Africa, were permanently lost. After Harun's death in 809, the divisions within the caliphate were fully exposed. His succession plan involved dividing the caliphate between two sons born to different women, one to his Arab wife, the other to a Persian concubine. The division was intended to appease both the Syrians and Persians, who were the two main political factions and rivals within the caliphate, as I've mentioned. Although it kept the peace in his own lifetime, it sparked a devastating civil war between the two sons, supported by their respective Syrian and Persian forces. The Persian son Al-Mamun defeated and killed his brother, but not before he'd attacked and devastated parts of Baghdad. The turning point, in my view, came when Al-Mamun's successor, Al-Mutasim, who reigned from 833 to 842, recruited Turkish slave soldiers in preference to Syrians and Persians. He did this to overcome the factionalism between the Syrians and Persians, but he only succeeded in effectively outsourcing the Abbasid army to Turkish mercenaries. The situation was, I think, similar to what happened to the Roman Empire in the late 4th century AD, when legionary armies were replaced by Gothic mercenaries who ended up sacking Rome in AD 410. History is littered with examples like this of the servant turning against the master, and the history of the Abbasid Caliphate is, I suggest, one of the best of these. Al-Mutazim liked the idea of using Turkish mercenaries because they were excellent soldiers and loyal to him only. At first he used them to crush his opposition, and it seemed as if the caliphate might be stronger than it was before, but he quickly found that the barbaric behaviour of the Turks, most of whom weren't Muslims, antagonized the inhabitants of Baghdad, so that in 836 he had to move both them and his government to a new capital, Samarra, some 70 miles north of Baghdad. He attempted to make the new capital as impressive as Baghdad by building palaces and mosques, some of whose remains can still be seen today, lying proud and desolate in the Iraqi desert. Al-Mutasim used his Turks to defeat the Byzantines and to sack Amorium in 838. And when he died in 841, it looked as if the Abbasid Caliphate's power and prestige had been restored. But in reality, he'd signed its death warrant. The Turks came to control the caliphs, just like the Gothic mercenaries had held the Romans to ransom in the 5th century. The situation became critical in the years from 861 to 870, during the so-called Anarchy of Samarra, when the Turks appointed a succession of 4 caliphs, always looking for the one who'd just pay them more. Another reason for Abbasid decline was economic. At the start of the Abbasid Caliphate, Iraq, or Mesopotamia as the Greeks called it, was overwhelmingly the wealthiest part of the Islamic world, really because the unification of the Roman and Persian halves of Mesopotamia led to increased trade. Indeed, we can say that Baghdad's prosperity was a product of this newfound wealth. But in the 9th and 10th centuries, as Iraq became the battlefield between rival Persian and Arab factions, and Baghdad itself endured 2 devastating sieges, it went into economic decline, accelerated by the collapse of the irrigation systems in Iraq, originally built by the Persians, which had long supported the province's agricultural fertility. As an illustration of this, one historian has estimated the tax revenues derived from the Sawad region of Iraq, which is the southern part, collapsed from around 100 million dirhams annually in around 700 to only 31 million in the year 918 to 919. This was devastating for the Abbasids, especially since they also lost the tax revenues from almost every other region in the former caliphate. In contrast, Egypt prospered and came to replace Iraq as the economic powerhouse of Islam during the 9th and 10th centuries. Much of this was because of a growing slave trade in the Mediterranean with the Carolingians, as well as increased trade through the Red Sea with India. This helped the new Tulunid and later Fatimid caliphates based in Egypt to grow and prosper. In the later 9th century, the Abbasid Caliphate splintered into different regional political entities. From 865 to 905, the Tulunids, who I've just mentioned, seized Egypt and most of Syria in the east. The Persian territories broke up into several different fiefdoms, with the Saffarids taking southern Iran and the Aghlabids, Tahrids and Samanids seizing control of the territories to the north. Arabia broke away completely under the Banu al-Hakudiyya dynasty. By 900, the Abbasids were left with only Baghdad, southern Iraq, and a strip of the western coastline of Arabia, which included Mecca and Medina. As their tax revenues dried up, they could no longer afford to pay their Turkish mercenaries, and in 945, an Iranian dynasty called the Buyids occupied Baghdad. The Abbasid caliphs ceased to have any political power and became nothing more than religious figureheads. This situation continued until the Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258, a transformative event for the history of Islam, but one outside the scope of this podcast. However, there is an important twist to our story. The political fragmentation of the Abbasid Caliphate didn't mean the end of Islam. Far from it. As mentioned earlier, during the period of the Umayyad Caliphate, most of the populations in the territories conquered by the Arabs had remained Christian or Zoroastrian. During the Abbasid Caliphate, however, conversion to Islam increased markedly. It's hard to measure this, but one historian has estimated that in 750, only 8% of the Iranian population was Muslim. However, by 800, this had increased to 40%, and by 900, it had grown to 75%. That's somewhat similar to the growth of Christianity in the Roman Empire, which had been almost non-existent during the Pax Romana, but which accelerated markedly during the 3rd century AD in response to the great crisis that nearly engulfed Rome, as we've discussed in earlier episodes of this podcast. In the case of Islam, the impetus for conversion came partly from the Abbasids' multicultural philosophy, which downgraded the importance of Arab descent and encouraged non-Arabs to convert and be treated as equals under Islamic law and regulation. This represented an important departure from the Umayyad practice of designating non-Arabs, or Mawali in Arabic as they were called, as inferior to Arabs. And I think there's a paradox here that's crucial to understanding the Abbasid Caliphate, for I suggest that while this grassroots Islamic growth contributed to the spread of Islam, it also encouraged political fragmentation. Ironically, it had been easier for the Umayyads to rule a highly centralized Arab-run empire in which most of the population were not Muslim than it was for the Abbasids to control the separatist tendencies of newly emerging Islamic states. And this fragmentation was the model for the future development of both Islam and Europe. Just as the breakup of the Carolingian Empire created the template for modern Europe, so the breakup of the Abbasid Caliphate created the template for modern Islam. By the year 900, the age of empires was over. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. In the next episode, in 2 weeks' time, on the 31st of January, we'll move back to Byzantium and its recovery against Islam. And if you like the podcast, why not leave a review, tell a friend, or best of all, sign up to my newsletter where you can get a free ebook. Just visit my website, nickholmesauthor.com, link in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.